I will tell you there's a couple of reasons that I'm here. Number one is because of this church. I want to start this morning by just really commending you and thanking you for being such an amazing and a biblical church. It's been my privilege to have a number of your guys that are part of your seminary extension campus here in my classes. That's been a real joy for me, especially I get to meet some of them like I did today for the first time in person. And yes, you do look taller in person than you do on my screen on the back wall. But it's a real joy and a privilege to be here and be a part of this service today, because you guys have a really impactful ministry that goes way beyond the four walls of this church. A number of churches around the world, I would say the majority of churches around the world, are primarily concerned about the ministry that happens on their campus and within their facility. And your investment in training up the next generation as an extension of what you're doing here is just really commendable, and it makes it a joy and a privilege to participate in ministry together with you. Secondly, it's a joy and privilege to be here because Brendan has always been one of my favorite problem students, and so that's been it's been neat to be able to interact with him these last couple of years in leading up to this. And then finally, I got to tell you that I am here because you have a very persistent pastor. He has also, I want to say thank you as well as a church for having such a broad vision of ministry in the church that you would let your pastor be a part of the Master's Seminary Board of Directors and be a part of training up the next generation here locally and continuing to participate in that down at the Master's Seminary. That's really a joy and privilege. But I don't know if you've noticed, but Scott can be a little bit persuasive. And he said, "Bryan, you got to come up. You got to minister to the people." So here I am, Scott. I'm ministering to the people. But it's a real joy and privilege to be with you. I want to talk to you this morning about heaven. Let's talk about heaven. If we were to conduct a survey asking this question, what is heaven like? And that's really the question we want to answer today. What is heaven like? I suspect we'd get a number of different answers. If you're looking from a worldly perspective, heaven is where you go when you die. You might even put a qualifier in there and say heaven is a place you go when you die if you're a good person. Most people would identify heaven as a better place, a fun place, a happy place, a place where my friends and family are, a place where I get to do fill in the blank all the time. And maybe it's fill in the blank and win all the time. Some people think it's a place where you get to go and play golf all the time. To me, that's contradictory with a happy place and a fun place, but anyways. I suspect most people, even believers, when they talk about heaven and think about what heaven is like, they first think about what they believe isn't there. Heaven is a place where there isn't pain, suffering, trials, hardship, tears, disappointments, goodbyes, strife, conflict, and the rest. The question I want to answer for us this morning, though, is what does the Bible say about what heaven is like? And before we get to that, one thing I do want to be clear about is that for the most part, when we use the term heaven, we're not actually referring to heaven. We're not talking about heaven primarily in the sense of it's the place where God dwells. Normally, when we use the term die and go to heaven, we're thinking about ultimately that eternal state that God has in store for us, that the Bible refers to as the new creation. So what I would like to do this morning very quickly, if you want to take your Bibles together with me, turn to Revelation chapter 19. By way of introduction, I want to walk through the middle of Revelation 19 and all the way through Revelation 20 to get to the text that we want to look at this morning, and that's Revelation 21, verses 1 to 8. But leading up to that, I just want you to see, when we talk, biblically speaking, about heaven, that what we're really talking about is the eternal state that God has in store for us. It is true that for a believer, absence from the body is presence with the Lord. That is going to heaven in a technical sense. That is entering into God's presence. But what we're really waiting for is Christ's return when we come back with Him. And then He brings in the kingdom and then ultimately the eternal state. In fact, we get to the consummation of the 70th seven of Daniel. I know that Scott has been taking you guys through Daniel. And when you get to that 70th seven, that 70th week of Daniel, then you get to the consummation of that tribulation period, Christ returns. And in Revelation 19 and verse 11, John writes about the end of that tribulation period. He says, I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. He who sat upon it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire. The idea of eyes are a flame of fire, or like a flame of fire, means when he looks, it's a penetrating gaze and he can see right through. On his head are many diadems. There are two words for crown in Greek. Stephanos, which is a reward for victory. A victor's crown, a trophy, so to speak. The wreath that you get to wear on your head for winning a race. And then there's a diadem. A diadem is a ruling crown. You'll notice that when heaven opens, there's a white horse, and the one who sits upon it is called Faithful and True. In righteousness he comes to judge and wage war against his enemies. On his head he has many ruling crowns. That's indicative of his total authority over all the earth. When he comes back, he has the full authority over every kingdom and over every nation. And he has a name written upon him which no one knows except himself. And he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called what? The Word of God. Who does this have to be then? This is Christ. This is Christ when he returns in full glory at the consummation of redemptive history as he is about to bring in his kingdom. This is the end of the 7-year tribulation. And you'll notice that he does not come alone. The armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. The important thing to point out here is notice the way the armies in heaven are dressed. They are not in body armor. They're not in Iron Man suits. They're not in military garb. They're in their Sunday best. They're in fine linen, white and clean. The robes that they were awarded for faithfulness. And they died and entered into the glories of Jesus Christ. And they're following him on white horses. Now we come to the climax of that tribulation period. You've got the Antichrist, and you've got all of his forces gathered together to make war with Christ and against the armies of heaven. But I want you to notice how this plays out. Hollywood would never make a movie out of this because the battle is no battle at all. The armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him, that is, following Christ on white horses. And from his mouth, that is Christ's mouth, comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. There's a reference there to Psalm 2. And he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty, a reference to the prophets. When he comes back, he comes to judge the wicked. He comes to judge those opposed to him. And notice how the conflict plays out. He speaks and it's over. There is no great conflict. There is no great battle. There is a word from Christ, and his enemies are laid low. It's done. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. King over all kings, Lord over all lords, absolute, total, sovereign over everything. And then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying to all the birds which fly in mid-heaven, Come, assemble for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of commanders, the flesh of mighty men, excuse me, and the flesh of horses and of those who sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and slaves, small and great. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're important or unimportant. Doesn't matter if you're slave. Doesn't matter if you're free. Doesn't matter if you're tall, short, rich, poor, anybody. And I saw the beast, the Antichrist, and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat upon the horse and against his army. And here's how the battle goes. The beast is seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who had worshipped his image, and these two were just thrown alive into the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. Gone. It's over. There's no contest. There's no great struggle. There's no great battle. There's no great epic scene where Christ is losing, and then he wins. Listen, that was the cross. All the rest of those who are arrayed together in preparation to battle the Lord of glory were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat upon the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. It's just one word and it's over. It's done. When Christ comes back at the end of the tribulation, that's the way it plays out. Not exciting, not close, just done. That's the power of our God. When he comes back, it's over. And then I saw, chapter 20, verse 1, an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss, and a great chain is in his hand. He lays hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Why? Because he is locked up and put out of the way for 1,000 years, so that all the promises that God has made to Israel and all the promises that God has made throughout the Old Testament of this glorious kingdom of the Messiah, so that all those promises now can be fulfilled in an earthly context. And Satan is thrown into the abyss, and it's shut and sealed over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. He is taken out of the mix for 1,000 years. You say, well, why does this happen? Well, number one, because the kingdom was promised, and God's going to fulfill all the promises he made to Israel and all the promises he made throughout the Old Testament. He is going to establish a literal kingdom here on this earth for 1,000 years. And yes, as Christians, we come back with him, and we are part of the administration of that kingdom government over all nations. And for that whole period of time, Satan is taken out of the mix. Why? So that in the end, it can be proven that you cannot say the devil made me do it. Notice in verse 4, I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, those who had not worshipped the beast or his image. Notice, these are those who were martyred during the tribulation period. Why is there a specific reference to those who are martyred during the tribulation period, middle of the verse, who had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand? They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Why is there a direct reference to those who died during the tribulation being resurrected at the end of the tribulation? I thought we all came back with Christ in the middle of Revelation 19. We did. The church is raptured out before the tribulation. Those who died during the tribulation get resurrected after Christ comes back and casts the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire and has Satan locked up. Then the tribulation saints who are martyred are resurrected. The rest who lived through the tribulation, who are part of the sheep, not the goats, they're still here on this earth. And they go into the kingdom as human beings like you and I are today. That's how you repopulate the kingdom. That's how you repopulate the earth for that 1,000 years. Notice it says, verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. What happens then? Verse 7, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. And he will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. You know what that means? After 1,000 years of Christ ruling and reigning here on this earth with a rod of iron, with glorified saints administering the government, and those who are saints that were resurrected at the end of the tribulation, plus Old Testament saints, all facilitating a glorious Christ-honoring kingdom. And all the people that went in, having been believers in the tribulation, went into the kingdom and repopulated the earth, the great majority of their children do not become believers. Even with a perfect Christ ruling and reigning perfectly with a rod of iron, even in a completely refurbished earth where the lion lays down with the lamb, even with all of that, the majority of people still do not submit to Christ. The number of them is like the sand on the seashore. Been to the coast lately? Been to the seashore? How much sand is there? An abundance. That's the point. And they all unite. When the wicked one is released, he has no problem gathering up a host of humanity to go make one last-ditch effort to get rid of Christ. Verse 9, and they came up on the broad plain of the earth. They surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, that is Jerusalem, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown in the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. A couple quick things to point out here. I want you to notice in verse 9, notice that a host of humanity together with the wicked one himself go to battle with Christ. And how does the battle go? Fire comes down from heaven and it's over. Nobody stands against God. Nobody. Including the wicked one. And notice how definitive his end is. It's at this point the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. There's no great clash. There's no great conflict. There's no ability to defend himself. He's just cast into the lake of fire. Maybe you've heard the old expression from Milton, it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. I got news for you. The same God who rules in heaven is the God who rules over hell. The wicked one is not in charge of hell. He is not in charge of tormenting people. Notice what his end is. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also. Notice this is 1,000 years later, and guess where the beast and the false prophet still are? In that same lake of fire. Hell is not going out of existence. Hell is enduring the wrath of God for eternity. Notice it says, the devil who deceived them is thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night. How long? Forever and ever. Let me ask you a question. How long is forever? It's forever. Well, then how long is forever and ever? It's not longer, it's just emphatic. Forever is enough to say it, but to say forever and ever means forever, and there's no reprieve. There's no second chance. There's no end. At this point, we read in verse 11 that I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. The entirety of this created realm, all of this creation that we see, and that we live and breathe and have our existence in presently, it was all going to be gone. It's all burned up. I could take you to 2 Peter and show you that description. But the point is, I saw a great white throne, John says. and him who sat upon it. Then this whole created realm fled away, and no place was found for them. This created realm in which we live is just gone. And I saw the dead, the great and the small. You know what that means? The important and the unimportant. Nobody escapes God's notice. And they were standing before the throne. And the books were open, and another book was open, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. I could go into an extended explanation here, but the sea and death and Hades, etc., meaning I don't care how you died, I don't care where you died, I don't care where your body is, there is no escaping this final judgment. And every single one is judged according to their deeds. Everybody that is not a believer, okay? Everybody that is not a believer stands before this great white throne, with the exception being the beast and the false prophet, who skipped judgment and because of their wickedness went straight into the lake of fire, and Satan, who's already been cast now into the lake of fire. Everybody else is resurrected and stands before the great white throne. And death and Hades, referring to their contents, were thrown in the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And here's the key, verse 15. If anyone's name is not found written in the book of life, he was thrown in the lake of fire. Why? Because everyone's judged according to their deeds. Everyone's judged according to their deeds. You know what your deeds are? Your deeds are the record that God has of every offense that you've committed, every sin you've committed, everything you've done that is forbidden by God, as well as everything that you haven't done that God expects you to do. God doesn't just say, don't do these things. He says, do this. He doesn't just say, don't be hateful, don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. He says, love your neighbor, love your enemy. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord in everything. Children, obey your parents, for this is what is right. All of these God has expectations of us that we live up to the image of God that He created us to exist in. And all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So if your name is written in the book of life, guess what that means? Christ has paid for all of that. You don't stand before the great white throne. But when it is demonstrated that your name is not in the book of life, okay, well then let's go through your list and you're going to answer for it. And nobody escapes this. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, guess what? He's thrown in the lake of fire. Why? Because there's no one righteous, not even one. Now it's at this point we get into the text that we want to look at this morning. And I have till what, 9:30? Okay, so Scott won't mind giving me his hour. Let's just go. No, I'm just kidding. So at this point, I want to take a look at the 8 verses in Revelation 21, verses 1 to 8. Judgment's been taken care of. The consummation of redemptive history has been completed. The wicked, together with the wicked one and his chief servants, have all been cast in the lake of fire. And now we get into what most of us are talking about when we use the term heaven. What is heaven like? What is heaven like? There are 4 key features of heaven that John sees that I want to share with you this morning that really ought to motivate us all the more when you see what heaven is like. When you see that this is what heaven in regard to the eternal state is really like, this really ought to motivate you. Not only to point friends and neighbors to Christ for the sake of their eternal soul, but also to live to the best of your ability to glorify Christ here and now as a believer. 4 key features of heaven that really ought to motivate us to live for Christ with all of our hearts until He returns for us or calls us home. The first feature that we see here is in verse 1. And that is that heaven is new. Heaven is new. If you're taking notes, 4 key features of heaven are, number one, heaven is new. Notice in verse 1, John says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." Why? Because the first heaven and the first earth passed away. This is a new creation. A brand new heaven and a brand new earth. A brand new created realm in which to live and breathe and have our existence. And by the way, the word new here means new in the sense of unused, fresh, brand new, just made. It's a qualitative word. It's a new heaven and a new earth, brand new. Not just a refurbishment of the same old elements. This is not a remodel. It's brand new. It's really difficult not to compare this to what we read in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You remember the 6-day account of creation? How God literally in 6 days takes the first 3 to fashion the earth into a perfect habitation, and then for the next 3 days fills it with perfect inhabitants. It's such a perfect creation that when you get to get to Genesis 1:31, that you get to the end of that 6th day, and God sees all that He has made, and behold, it is tov me'od. It is good exceedingly. Very good is the way most English translations have it. It's perfect. Well, now we have a new heaven and a new earth. Why? Because that first one that was perfect when it was created became corrupted when our greatest grandparents, yes, I think that's the right way, the perfect way, the proper way, the biblical way to refer to Adam and Eve. Your greatest grandparents and mine. Our greatest grandparents were created perfectly in the image of God. They were placed perfectly into the Garden of Eden in a perfect world. Well, why do we live in a sin, curse, and fallen world? Because our greatest grandparents sinned by a willful choice and action against God. It resulted in their expulsion from the garden, and it resulted in a cursing corruption with futility, the totality of that creation. Listen, when you get to Revelation 21 and verse 1, you want to know what's really awesome about heaven? First of all, it's brand new. It's not a refurbishment. It's not a reset. It's not a remodel. It's all new. The first heaven and the first earth passed away. That word passed away literally means to either pass away in the sense of departing or to pass away in the sense of going out of existence. And given that Jesus says in Matthew 25 and verse 35, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away," I would take this to mean that this entire created realm is done away with, and God starts fresh. Peter says it this way in 2 Peter 3, starting in verse 10, "The day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up." Now he turns this into an application, a motivational application, when he says, since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be destroyed by burning, and the elements will melt with intense heat. But according to His promise, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Listen. All of the stuff of this earth, it's going to burn up. It's not that important. Your eternal soul is, and the eternal souls of the people around you are. Everything that you do for God matters and lasts forever. Everything you do for you is temporary and fleeting. You see the instant change in prioritization when you start thinking like this? We really care about earthly stuff. We do. But it's all temporary. Notice that together with being new, the end of verse 1, John says, and there is no longer sea or any sea. It doesn't exist, period. Say, but I really like my boat, or I really like fishing, or I really like... Listen, I promise you, everything is better in this new creation. When we get there, I can prove that to you when he says, we won't even remember the things of the past. There's no longer any sea. Well, why is that a big deal? You know, there are a number of suggestions that the commentators make. Some say it's tied to the fact that the sea was fearful for travel in those days, and so if you want to go from place to place, you don't have to be afraid. Others say that it has to do with the sea as the source of evil in other religions. Still others suggest that in the book of Revelation, the beast is said to come up out of the sea, so there's no place for evil to spring forth. All of these are interesting ideas and images. But frankly, I think the best way is just to take it not as symbolic of anything, but literally. John says there's no longer any sea. Think about what the sea does. It separates land masses, right? Well, guess what? If this planet had no sea, how much more land would there be? You understand 70% of this globe that we live on is covered in water. Now, it's not that there isn't water there, but can you imagine how much real estate there would be on this earth if there was no sea? Can you imagine that? Listen, that's the kind of description that we're given here. And this new creation is built for inhabitants and not just a few. Heaven is new. Secondly, heaven is holy. The second key feature here is that heaven is not only new, it's holy. Notice verse 2. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. I want you to notice this. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Now think about this for a minute. We're in a brand new creation. So there's no corruption. There's no sin. There's no futility. It's a brand new earth. And this new Jerusalem that we're going to live in, okay, listen, it is not created out of material from this new creation. It's created in heaven by God personally, and it comes down out of heaven from God into this new creation. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Listen, this is what the author of Hebrews is talking about in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11. You remember when he's talking about by faith Abraham, by faith Moses, by faith all the Old Testament saints? They were all living by faith because they were looking for a city whose maker and builder is God. They were looking forward to living in this new Jerusalem, a residence that God Himself has made, a heavenly residence. This is a city whose construction is not made with hands. This is a city that isn't even manufactured out of stuff in the new creation by the hands of redeemed men. This is a city whose maker and builder is God, created in heaven itself. This is the personal residence or home of God. Remember when Jesus in the upper room tells his disciples he's going to leave and they're all anxious? He says, don't worry, I go to prepare a place for you. In my Father's what? House, there are many dwelling places. This is the Father's house. This is it. The Father's house is not a building. It's a city. It's the New Jerusalem. And in round numbers, when it gets measured, if you want to see the details, starting in chapter 21 of Revelation, verse 10, all the way to the end of the chapter, you'll see that the angel is asked to measure it for the sake of John. You know what the dimensions of this city are? According to both human measurements and angelic measurements, because those are the same according to the text. You know how big this city is? It is from Los Angeles to Denver, Colorado squared. Cubed. So it is from LA to Colorado, that long, that deep, and that high. Some say, well, it's a pyramid, not a cube. Okay, still pretty big. Still pretty big. I think it's a cube, but either way, a massive structure. Listen, that's the New Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven. That's the personal residence, heavenly residence of God that comes down and is part of this new creation. You want to talk about what heaven is as far as the eternal destiny of God's people? It is way bigger than most of us ever think about, imagine, or consider. Okay? Heaven is holy. He describes us as a bride made ready, adorned for her husband. I remember when I got married. I still remember it to this day, standing in a building not unlike this, about the same size as this room. And my wife, actually the door was just a little bit over to there. When she came in and came over this way and then walked straight down the aisle, I can still, with vivid recollection, I can see the flowing white ruffles? I don't know. It sounds like potato chips to me, but anyways, I remember how awesome she looked. Okay, let's just put it that way. And I remember as she had these they were called fire and ice red roses with the white on them, and she's coming in, and all I could think is, I cannot believe she's mine. I cannot believe I get to marry her. I was just so overwhelmed. Still to this day, I feel this way. And she looked just absolutely amazing. And over 30 plus years of getting to know her, her person is way more attractive to me now than her physical appearance was then. But I still remember that moment. And that's the kind of descriptive language that John uses to describe this new creation, and in particular, the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. Made ready like a bride adorned for her husband. Having been prepared is literally the Greek term. When Paul in 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 9 says, things which eye has not seen and ear has not heard and which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love him. That's the same word. You have no idea how really amazing this new creation that God has in store for us is. It's new. It's holy. What does holy mean? Set apart, especial unto God. You know, in my day, I'm from the Midwest originally, okay? I spent the first 30-some years of my life in the Midwest. And Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Mother's Day were big-time events. And my grandmothers both had a china hutch or a china cabinet. I still don't know the difference between the two, but maybe it's whether it has glass doors or not. I don't know. But they both had those. And then my mom had the same thing. And when it came Thanksgiving, Christmas dinner or Mother's Day, guess what happened? All the family comes over, and those dishes get brought out, and they get sat on a table. Now, the kids sit on a card table in the other room, and they eat off the regular dishes, okay? But I still remember when I graduated to the adult table. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, okay? But I remember it. And then you sit there and you're anxious about, okay, which fork goes where, and don't bang the dishes because these are holy dishes. There's the common ones, the profane ones that are at the kids' table. The holy ones are the ones that nobody but mom washes, and they go straight back into the cabinet. You know, we think of holy as being pure and without sin, and profane as filthy language and dirty stuff. Listen, the difference between holiness and profanity is holy means set apart as special. Profane means common. Okay, now the extremes are sinless perfection and vulgarity and filth. But holy literally just means set apart as special. In fact, if you want to talk about the chief attribute of God, it's kind of a futile argument, but if you want to talk about what's really most special about God, it's His holiness. Why? Not just the absence of sin or imperfections, but that He is so set apart as distinct from us. He's the creator, we're just creatures. Okay? He is holy. That's why He says, you shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Holy doesn't just mean don't sin. Holy means be set apart as special unto me. Totally distinct from the way everybody else is because you're mine. What you think, what you do, what you want, the way you behave, what your priorities and values are, ought to be way different than everybody else because of who you are, or rather because of whose you are. Now, this is the holy city. This is a city that's characterized by holiness because of the God who is holy, whose residence it is. Talk about the key features of heaven. Heaven is new, heaven is holy. And I couldn't come up with a better word, so for point 3, we'll just make it heaven is wonderful. Heaven is wonderful. You say, well, that sounds kind of cool, but couldn't you come up with a better one? Well, how about righteous, awesome, spectacular? I could use today's lingo and say it's dope or it's wicked, but when I grew up, those were bad things. Heaven is spectacular. Heaven is awesome. Heaven is wonderful. It's glorious. It's magnificent. It's indescribably awesome. But nowadays, even a dessert can be awesome, so that word has kind of lost its punch. I don't know what your favorite word is, but put it here. Whatever's most spectacular in your lingo, put that word here, because that's what heaven is. Notice in verses 3 to 5. I heard a loud voice from the throne. This is the throne in heaven. This is about the 20th time that John, as you go through the book of Revelation, that he has heard a loud voice throughout the book, and each time it emphasizes the importance and greatness of the message itself about what is or is about to happen. And in this case, it's a voice that comes from the throne. Who's seated on the throne? God. Who's around about the throne? His most holy angels. And what's the voice say? Behold. This is one of those words, by the way, the word behold. This is one of those words that we hit and we often skip over. We just read it and move on. But behold is a word like what your son will use when he's really excited. So it's a, Mom, check it out. Dad, check this out. That's that idea of behold. From the throne, you just seen the holy city coming down, right? And here's what the throne announces. Check this out. Pay special attention to this. The tabernacle of God is among men, and He will dwell among them, and they will be His people, and God Himself will be among them. Okay, this is what is over the top awesome about heaven. Not just that it's a brand new creation with no flaws and no sin and none of that stuff. Not just that there's a holy city that comes down made out of heavenly stuff by God Himself that is present in this new creation, but what that entails. You know who lives in that city, whose maker and builder is God? You know who lives in that new Jerusalem? God Himself. He is personally going to take up residence no longer in the heavenly realm, but from this point on in His new creation with us. Behold, the tabernacle, the movable residence of God. You see the tabernacle in the Old Testament. That's where God dwelt among His people, right? Why was it in a tent? Because it moved along with the people. And then it became fixed in a place in Jerusalem. Well, now this is the New Jerusalem, the holy city that's been the residence of God in the ultimate sense in heaven for all eternity. And now it comes down as part of the new creation. The tabernacle of God is among men, and He will dwell among them. God will personally reside together with us. Ever been a time when you wish in a time of prayer that you could see God, that you could hear His voice, that you could just know what He thinks and hear directly from Him? Okay, that's what eternity is. That's what heaven in the way we talk about it is. And He will dwell among them, and they will be His people, and God Himself. You could even translate it this way: God personally will be among them. They will be His people. And by the way, that's emphatic as well. They themselves will be His people. We will literally be in a right relationship with Him, in personal communion and fellowship forever. He will live with us personally. This is the real reward of heaven. The biggest thrill, the greatest joy, the most magnificent blessing, the most astounding promise given to us concerning heaven is that God is there. And He will bring us permanently into His sovereign, almighty, and holy presence and live together with us in perfect communion and fellowship forever. And if that does not thrill your soul, it's because you have either way too low a view of God or too high a view of yourself in this earth. This sin-cursed and fallen world is the weakest, most shadowy reflection of what the new creation will really be. You know, in Genesis chapter 3, you know what the greatest loss in human history was? It was not access to the Garden of Eden. It was not a perfect relationship between husband and wife. You know what it was? Intimate communion and fellowship with our God. Notice in verse 4, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Notice it says every tear. The King James says all tears. There's not a great distinction here, except to say every tear in Greek means literally every single one. Every tear is wiped away from their eyes. No longer death. No longer mourning, crying, or pain. The first things have passed away. Suffering of all kinds is a thing of the past. Sufferings include the threat of disease and death, accidents and tragedies, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, war, cancer, AIDS, birth defects, murder, kidnapping, rape, theft, assault, corruption, wickedness, and deception all around. There's always the threat that at any time in this life that your world could come crashing down with the loss of a child or a loved one, with a diagnosis of a sickness, a disease, or an illness. There's the threat of losing employment. There's the threat of losing your home, your health, your ability to work. There's the fact of old age, which is continually creeping up on all of us. Some of us, like me, a little faster than others, but you'll get there if you live long enough. My dad always told me, don't get old, you'll live to regret it. You know what? Old age brings with it aches and pains and increasing degrees of feebleness. And one of the toughest things is you don't realize you can't do that anymore until you do it, and now it hurts. Oh, I guess I can't do that anymore. There's the struggle with your own flesh and the corruptions of this world, your inability to put down sin in your flesh permanently because you still dwell in the body of this death. And the fact that no one in this world is perfect, and so there's pain and heartbreak in every single relationship you have. And on it goes. Do you know what heaven isn't? It isn't any of those. It really is a perfect relationship with God and with each other forever. And it's permanently that way. Notice verse 5. He who sits on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And he said, write, for these words are faithful and true. So he tells John at this point, write it down, because this is going to happen. Isaiah 65. Isaiah says this, behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing and her people for gladness. And I will also rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. And there will no longer be heard in her the voice of weeping and the sound of crying. All those things are passed away. Heaven is new, heaven is holy, heaven is wonderful. All right, that brings us to the last one. Are you ready? Very quickly. Heaven is exclusive. Heaven is exclusive. Here's where back home at Roosevelt, where I preach, here's where I get accused of transitioning from preaching to meddling. But some of us need meddling at this point, so I direct your attention to verses 6 to 8. Notice that at this point, God from the throne says to John writes, then he said to me, it is done, it's finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. There is water in this new creation. It's from the spring of the water of life, and it sustains us forever. And he who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. God is our Father. We are his children, and we are in a parent-child relationship with him perfectly forever in this new creation. We literally will see him and not shrink away in fear, because we will have been made perfect. This is the 8th time the term overcomer is used in the book of Revelation. 7 times it appears in chapters 2 and 3. And when you look at the characteristics of an overcomer in those 7 letters to the 7 churches, you'll notice the overcomer eats from the tree of life, is not hurt by the second death, is given a white stone, receives power over the nations, won't have his name or her name blotted out of the book of life, will be a pillar in the temple of God, and will sit with Christ on his throne. And now in summary fashion, it simply says, wrapping it up all together, he who overcomes will inherit these things in total, and I will be his God, and he will be my son or my child. Verse 8, but For the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Their part is already handled back in Revelation 20. They don't enter into this new creation at all. Completely excluded from it. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these different descriptives in verse 8, but I'm going to cherry pick a couple of the ones I think that are most misunderstood. Notice he says, first of all, for the cowardly and unbelieving. Well, cowardice seems like a weird thing for God to be unhappy with, for God to condemn somebody eternally for, right? Doesn't it seem a little strange? Well, it does, until you realize that what we're really talking about is when Jesus says, if anyone wants to come after me, he's got to deny himself, take up his what? Cross and follow me. When you think about that call of Christ to discipleship, deny yourself means you say no to you. Follow me means you follow him and do what he says. But what does take up your cross mean? I've heard people say, well, it's living with my wife. Well, it's living with my husband. Oh, it's my boss. What happened to everybody that picked up a cross in Jesus' day? What happened to them? They died. What was very characteristic, not just in the first century, but periodically throughout all of church history, what has been very characteristic of being a Christian and being identified with Jesus Christ? The threat of death. Cowardly is for those who commit to Christ and then shrink away. Do not stay true. You remember Jesus said, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Cowardice here is in the sense of those who shrink back under the threat of harm or persecution. You know, in our context, in our cultural context, cowardice is when you aren't willing to give up a friendship. You aren't willing to stand for Christ in your job. You aren't willing to stand for Christ in your extended family. When you, in a cowardly way, shrink under the pressures of the world of any kind. Cowardly and unbelieving, their part is in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, the second death. Abominable, murderers, immoral persons, those all make sense. Gross forms of evil. Sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. Sorcerers is where we get the word pharmacy from. Pharmakeia. Those engaged in drugs for the sake of just getting high as it's part of the worship system, especially in the temple cult systems. Idolaters, those who worship anything other than God. And all liars. Their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. You put all this together, and what do we learn? We learn that heaven is new, heaven is holy, heaven is wonderful, but heaven is also exclusive. Now, if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, there's two ways this ought to impact you. Number one, it ought to greatly encourage you as you go through trials and tragedies and as you experience triumphs and many blessings in this earthly existence where you give thanks to God and you live to the best of your ability, storing for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves can't break in and steal, and really living for God, not worried about how this earthly life plays out, mostly worried about how you can glorify God to the best of your ability while you're here in this life. Amen? And genuinely concerned about the eternal destiny of the people around you. How many of you, I would ask a show of hands, but for the sake of time, I'll just do it this way. How many of you know someone that's an unbeliever? And I don't just mean the kids in your household. How many of you know an unbeliever? Have you shared Christ with them? Have you broached the subject? Because we're talking about eternal consequences here. Yeah, but that guy is just really, but she's just really, you know what? That was me. And before God opened your eyes to the truth, that was you. Heaven is new, heaven is holy, heaven is wonderful, but heaven is also exclusive. The one thing that you and I can do in this life while we're here right now that we will not be able to do in heaven, you want to know what it is? Point people to Christ that don't know him. We'll all sing gloriously. Even the best of us singing now will sing way better in heaven. Even the best of us living a Christ-honoring life here and now will live way better in heaven. The one thing you can't do in heaven, in this Revelation 21, 1-8 sense, is point lost people to Christ. Let me just encourage you, take advantage of the time that God has given you here in this sin-cursed and fallen world. Not just to live for him in your home and your own personal life, but to point the lost people around you to him. Yeah, but I'm just afraid if I get out and I might lose this relationship or a promotion or whatever else. I remind you of that first term, the cowardly and unbelieving. Don't be a coward. Be bold, be faithful, and be a Christ-honoring witness to him.